What makes an air combat film feel too real? The sound of metal tearing through clouds, or the moment a pilot stares death in the face with calm resolve. These are not just movies, they are experiences that shake the soul. Some were banned, others forgotten. Yet everyone left real pilots silent. So strap in, because this flight is about to turn deadly real. Number 15. Battle of Britain, 1969. Yes, when this film roared into cinemas, it was both a historical tribute and a cinematic battlefield of its own. Critics hailed it as ambitious, pilots called it haunting. Battle of Britain recreated the skies of 1940 with terrifying authenticity, using real Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Messerschmitts flown by veteran pilots. The scale was enormous, the tension electric, and the realism almost unbearable. The story follows desperate British pilots fighting overwhelming German odds. There is no Hollywood heroism here, only exhaustion and loss. Director Guy Hamilton insisted on live aerial choreography, no miniatures, no fakery. This obsession led to near collisions in the air and production chaos on the ground. Crews complained of deafening noise and clouds of oil smoke so thick that some refused to continue. It was controversial in Europe, where some governments feared it reignited old wounds. In Germany, veterans protested depictions of Luftwaffe arrogance. In Britain, the Ministry of Defense nearly withdrew support over the cost and authenticity debates. Yet pilots everywhere admitted it captured the claustrophobic terror of dogfighting better than any film before or since. Today, Battle of Britain stands as a monument to realism. No digital trickery, no false heroics. Just the cold sky and men whose courage became their only weapon. Number 14. The Right Stuff, 1983. Yes, this film did not just honor the first test pilots, it redefined the meaning of risk. Based on Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff explored the thin line between aviation and madness. It showed how post-war pilots pushed jets beyond breaking point just to touch the edge of space. The result was both majestic and terrifying. Director Philip Kaufman refused to use models. Real aircraft were flown across the desert. The sonic boom sequences were so powerful that nearby towns filed noise complaints. Chuck Yeager himself appeared on set, advising actors and demanding realism so intense that stunt pilots called it dangerous. But here's the twist. NASA quietly distanced itself from the production, fearing it exposed too much of the internal chaos behind the early space program. Some officials even tried to suppress access to real footage. Despite the tension, the film became a masterpiece, a hymn to human daring and the loneliness of speed. When pilots saw it, they nodded in silence. The sound of jet engines, the desert's blinding glare, the trembling of a cockpit before braking Mach 1. It was not just a movie. It was muscle memory filmed in light. Number 13. 12 O'Clock High, 1949. Before computer effects, before cockpit mock-ups, there was 12 O'Clock High. It was the first film that showed the mental collapse of airmen under relentless bombing missions. Gregory Peck delivered a performance that military psychologists still use for trauma studies. The film was raw, grim, and unsentimental. It told the story of a bomber group pushed beyond endurance by a commander torn between duty and compassion. The realism came from actual combat footage spliced into the film. The U.S. Army Air Forces initially resisted, fearing it would reveal the true horror of daylight raids. When released, it shocked audiences who expected glory and found despair instead. Behind-the-scenes filming was brutal. Crews filmed inside real B-17s during dangerous maneuvers. Several veterans on set broke down during takes, unable to relive those missions again. The government almost banned its overseas screening, fearing it would damage morale among allies still recovering from war. But pilots loved it. They said it captured the silence before takeoff and the sickening moment when another aircraft simply disappeared into the clouds. 12 O'Clock High remains more than a film. It is an unflinching document of courage cracking under pressure. Number 12. The Hunters, 1958. Yes, The Hunters arrived in theaters like a thunderclap of jet noise and moral confusion. Critics saw it as a slick fighter drama, but real pilots recognized something darker beneath the glamour. Set during the Korean War, it followed a squadron of American F-86 Sabre pilots battling both the enemy and their own fears of irrelevance in an age of faster machines. Director Dick Powell filmed real aerial combat sequences using operational Sabres and MiG replicas at full throttle. The G-forces were authentic, the heat blistering. Actor Robert Mitchum trained in real cockpits and came away shaken, admitting the experience had changed how he viewed war forever. The production faced turbulence when several aircraft sustained near catastrophic failures mid-flight, forcing emergency landings that almost ended filming. Its controversy stemmed from the way it stripped away heroism and replaced it with obsession. The studio feared audiences would reject its cold tone. Military advisors warned it bordered on insubordination, showing pilots disobeying orders in pursuit of personal glory. In Japan, it was even briefly pulled from theaters for being too raw in its portrayal of American recklessness. But pilots who saw it decades later called it prophetic. They said it showed the psychological erosion of men who lived too close to death and speed. The Hunters may have looked like a drama, but what it truly captured was the addiction of flight, the seductive call of danger that never lets go. Number 11. Top Gun, 1986. Top Gun was never meant to be real. It was meant to be myth, yet somehow the myth became truth. Real Navy pilots still call it the most accurate depiction of the emotional chaos of flying a supersonic jet. It was not the maneuvers that mattered, it was the loneliness, the rivalry, the silence between radio calls when your fate balanced on a single control input. Director Tony Scott turned the sky into a cathedral of sound and flame. The U.S. Navy lent real F-14s and carriers, but insisted on reviewing every frame. The Pentagon feared it might expose classified flight routines. Several sequences were toned down or rewritten, but the danger remained physical. Cameramen vomited from G-forces, actors fainted inside cockpits, and flight crews performed stunts at the very edge of safety limits. Behind the scenes, a real tragedy occurred when stunt pilot Art Scholl was killed while filming an inverted spin over the Pacific. His footage was never recovered. The accident cast a shadow over the film, but also gave it an eerie authenticity that pilots still feel when they watch it. Top Gun became propaganda inspiration and nightmare all at once. It made flying look beautiful, but every pilot who has lived through turbulence and loss knows that beauty often hides pain. Number 10. The Dam Busters, 1955. Yes, The Dam Busters is the film that defined British courage in the air and the price that came with it. Released just a decade after the war, it dramatized Operation Chastise, the legendary mission where RAF pilots flew impossibly low to destroy German dams using revolutionary bouncing bombs. It was patriotic, but painfully accurate. Director Michael Anderson insisted on recreating every flight maneuver exactly as it happened. Real Lancasters skimmed the surface of reservoirs at night, often just feet above the water. Several near accidents forced temporary halts. The RAF monitored filming closely, fearing it might expose classified bombing techniques that were still in use. Controversy erupted over the film's unflinching portrayal of loss. Nearly half the real crews involved in the operation had died. Some families called the movie exploitative, others found it healing. Censors debated cutting scenes that showed the slow deaths of pilots trapped in doomed aircraft, but Anderson refused, saying truth mattered more than comfort. In later years, its influence spread everywhere, from Star Wars trench-run sequences to modern air combat simulators. Pilots say The Dam Busters captures the cruel beauty of precision flying where every mistake is fatal. Watching it feels like standing on the edge of history and hearing the echo of engines that never came home. Number 9. Memphis Belle, 1990. Yes, when Memphis Belle took off in theaters, it felt less like a Hollywood production and more like a resurrection of the past. Based on the true story of the first U.S. bomber crew to complete 25 missions in World War II, it was meant to celebrate courage. Yet the realism was so overwhelming that many veterans could not finish watching it. Director Michael Caton Jones aimed for absolute authenticity. He used real B-17 flying fortresses rebuilt from museum pieces and flown under combat conditions. crews endured freezing wind blasts inside open bomb bays and deafening propeller noise that rattled every nerve. No soundstage comfort, no digital effects, only real men inside real machines trembling in the cold. The air sequences were choreographed using military precision, each one filmed against a blood-red sky of smoke and chaos. The controversy came not from Hollywood, but from history. Survivors of the actual Memphis Belle missions objected to how close the film came to their trauma. Some felt their memories were being exploited, while others praised the truth it captured. The Pentagon hesitated to assist, fearing the movie's emotional tone might expose too much of the mental toll behind bomber glory. During filming, 2 aircraft nearly collided over England while recreating formation maneuvers. The pilots pulled up seconds before impact. Crew members wept on set, realizing how little separated cinema from disaster. When released, the movie became a haunting echo of real experience. Pilots called it the closest depiction of the exhaustion, fear, and silent heroism that defined bomber crews. Memphis Belle endures as a cinematic time capsule. It reminds us that even victory in the air carries the weight of ghosts. Number 8. Flight of the Intruder, 1991. Flight of the Intruder dropped into theaters during the Gulf War era, but its soul belonged to Vietnam. Adapted from Stephen Kuntz's novel, it followed naval aviators flying A-6 Intruders into North Vietnam without air support. Critics dismissed it as a macho action flick, yet military pilots saw truth in every frame. Director John Milius, a real pilot enthusiast, turned the film into a hymn for those who flew low and slow through anti-aircraft fire. The production used real U.S. Navy A-6 bombers filmed from aircraft carriers under full operational conditions. The actors, including Willem Dafoe and Danny Glover, experienced such intense G-forces that their bodies bruised from safety harnesses. The Navy imposed strict control, but still several maneuvers went too far, forcing emergency landings that rattled even veteran flyers. Behind the scenes, the film faced turbulence of its own. The Department of Defense briefly pulled its cooperation, fearing that its plot about pilots defying orders might encourage real-world dissent. Milius fought back, claiming that the movie was about moral courage, not rebellion. That argument nearly ended the film until a group of retired aviators petitioned to have production resumed. Upon release, audiences were divided. Some saw it as reckless, others as deeply honest. Real pilots recognized the haunting realism of night bombing runs the eerie glow of radar screens, the tension of flying blind through darkness. They said the Waba'au movie captured not just combat, but the strange love affair between man and machine that defines every pilot's life. Flight of the Intruder may not have been a hit, but among those who understand the silence after a mission, it became sacred. Number 7. The Blue Max, 1966. The Blue Max stands alone as one of the most daring World War I aviation epics ever filmed. It told the story of a German pilot obsessed with winning his nation's highest honor for valor. On the surface, it was a historical drama, but beneath it lay an unsettling truth about ambition, pride, and the seductive power of flight. Director John Guillermin refused to rely on miniatures. Every scene in the Blue Max used real aircraft designed to replicate the fragile wood and canvas biplanes of 1917. The dogfights were filmed in open skies over Ireland, using pilots who risked their lives for each take. Several stunts went catastrophically wrong. One crash killed a veteran pilot and forced the crew to ground production for weeks. Yet Guillermin insisted that the realism was worth the price. The film's controversy came from its moral darkness. It portrayed the German air service as fractured and desperate, and its hero as vain and cruel. Censors in several countries debated cutting scenes of political corruption and psychological collapse. Even the German government objected to what it called emotional blasphemy against its wartime pilots. But Guillermin refused to soften his vision. When it premiered, audiences were stunned. The aerial battles felt terrifyingly real. The sound of splintering wood, the gasp of engines dying mid-flight, the camera trembling as planes spiraled toward the earth. Veterans of both world wars later called it one of the most truthful depictions of air combat ever captured. The Blue Max still flies in the imagination of every pilot who has ever looked down from the clouds and seen both glory and death staring back. Number 6. The Bridges at Toko-Ri, 1954. Yes, The Bridges at Toko-Ri was born from fire and regret. Based on James Michener's novel, it was a reflection on the Korean War and the forgotten men who fought it. Critics praised it as poetic, yet it struck deeper for those who had lived that life. For pilots, it was not fiction, it was memory made visible. The story follows a U.S. Navy jet pilot played by William Holden, ordered on near-suicidal missions to bomb heavily defended bridges in North Korea. Director Mark Robson filmed aboard real aircraft carriers and used operational F-9 Panthers for the flight scenes. The sequences were shot in freezing weather with ocean spray striking the lenses and pilots enduring real takeoff pressures. There was no cinematic trickery. Every landing felt like life or death. Controversy erupted when the Navy objected to the film's bleak tone. They feared it portrayed American command as careless and detached. The studio was pressured to change the ending, but Michener refused. He had seen those missions firsthand as a correspondent and demanded the truth be told. The result was a film that dared to question whether heroism and futility could coexist. Behind the scenes, Holden's quiet dread mirrored his character's despair. He spent hours with real carrier pilots absorbing their trauma. The final crash landing scene was so emotional that even hardened crew members wept on set. Pilots later said the movie captured something no briefing or memoir ever could: the crushing silence after the engines die and the mission is over. The Bridges at Toko-Ri remains one of the most human depictions of air warfare ever filmed. Its message still echoes through hangars and cockpits. Where do we find heroes and who remembers them when they fall? Number 5. Only Angels Have Wings, 1939. Before war films turned the sky into spectacle, Only Angels Have Wings turned it into a cathedral. Howard Hawks directed this story about male pilots flying through deadly mountain passes in South America. It was released before World War II, but its tension and realism were decades ahead of their time. The film opens with joy but quickly descends into dread. Pilots face impossible weather and failing machines for the sake of duty. Cary Grant plays the leader of a small air service who must send his friends to their deaths to keep the mail running. Hawks used real stunt flyers and pushed them to extremes. Many sequences were shot through fog storms and artificial wind gusts strong enough to knock cameras over. Hollywood censors demanded cuts, claiming the film's fatalism was too dark for audiences expecting adventure. Studios feared it might discourage recruitment at a time when war loomed, but Hawks refused to change a frame. He said he was not making a film about planes, but about men who lived knowing death was always overhead. The production was grueling. Pilots flew obsolete aircraft through real canyons with almost no safety oversight. One crash nearly killed the lead stunt pilot. The crew worked in freezing rain and choking smoke created to simulate fog. Yet out of that chaos came something pure. Pilots who later fought in Europe and the Pacific called it prophetic. It captured the fatal calm that defines every flyer who knows one wrong move ends everything. Only Angels Have Wings does not celebrate aviation, it understands it with reverence and sorrow. Number 4. The Tuskegee Airmen, 1995. Yes, the Tuskegee Airmen told a story that America had ignored for 50 years. It chronicled the real-life black fighter squadron that defied segregation and prejudice to become one of the most effective combat groups of World War II. The film aired on television, but its realism and emotion were so intense that military institutions still use it as a teaching tool. Director Robert Markowitz worked with real P-51s and T-6 Texans, converted to resemble wartime fighters. The flying scenes were practical, filmed against wide desert skies with actual combat formations. Lawrence Fishburne and Cuba Gooding Jr. trained with retired Air Force pilots to understand not only the technical details, but the quiet dignity behind each mission. Behind the scenes, the production faced political pushback. Some advisors wanted the story softened, removing scenes that showed racism within the ranks. The filmmakers refused. They wanted the truth, not the myth. During production, aircraft nearly collided during one maneuver over Arizona, forcing an emergency landing that ended shooting for the day. It became a reminder that even reenactments carried danger. When it premiered, real Tuskegee veterans wept. They said it was the first time anyone had shown how they really lived and fought. The film received awards, but more importantly, it received respect from pilots who knew the burden of being first in a world that doubted them. The Tuskegee Airmen stands today as both tribute and warning. It proves that courage means more than flying through gunfire. Sometimes it means flying through hate and doing it anyway. Number 3. The Great Waldo Pepper, 1975. Yes, the Great Waldo Pepper was not about war, but about what came after. It captured the restless souls of pilots who survived World War I only to find themselves lost in peacetime. Directed by George Roy Hill and starring Robert Redford, it told the story of a barnstormer who risks everything for one last taste of glory. For real pilots, it struck a nerve. The flying scenes were legendary. Hill rejected miniatures and wires. Every aerial stunt was performed for real using authentic biplanes. Stunt pilots flew at suicidal altitudes barely 100 feet above the ground, weaving between barns, bridges, and windmills. One mid-air crash went terrifyingly wrong when 2 aircraft clipped wings. Both pilots survived, but filming was halted for days while crews repaired the wrecks in their courage. The controversy came from the film's melancholic message. It suggested that aviation heroism was a dying art replaced by spectacle and commercial greed. The studio executives feared it would fail, but Redford insisted the world needed to remember the dreamers who flew before fame and politics cheapened flight. Critics were divided. Some called it nostalgic. Others said it was too painful to watch. Behind the scenes, Hill treated the air as a stage for human fragility. He filmed using long silent takes that captured the stillness before danger struck. The result felt eerily authentic. Real pilots said they could feel the G force the wind and the moment of decision when survival balanced on instinct. The Great Waldo Pepper endures as an elegy to the reckless courage of early flyers. It reminds viewers that every sky conquered leaves behind a price written in smoke. Number 2. Tora, 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 1970. Yes, Tora, Tora, Tora was one of the most ambitious air combat films ever made. It chronicled the attack on Pearl Harbor from both American and Japanese perspectives and did it with chilling realism. No computer effects, no digital tricks. Every explosion and dive bomb was real, captured by cameras mounted on aircraft flying at combat speeds. The film became a joint production between American and Japanese crews, which led to endless tension. The Japanese director Kinji Fukasaku insisted on historical precision while the American team wanted dramatic impact. The result was chaos. Filming took years, cost millions, and left dozens of wrecked planes in its wake. Controversy erupted before release. U.S. Navy officials tried to delay it, fearing it reopened wounds that had not healed. Some theaters in Hawaii refused to screen it altogether. Yet veterans who saw it said it was the closest thing to reliving the confusion and fear of that morning. They recognized the small details. The shock of anti-aircraft fire, the sight of pilots flying into walls of smoke, the disbelief when the impossible became real. Behind the scenes, several explosions went too far, injuring stunt performers. The Japanese miniatures unit was forced to rebuild sets after fire destroyed an entire soundstage. Yet all of this contributed to a film that remains unmatched for realism. Pilots still use scenes from Tora, Tora, Tora in flight training demonstrations because its depiction of formation flying and bombing accuracy is historically perfect. It may have caused discomfort, but it also preserved truth. For pilots, it is not a war movie. It is a documentary filmed in fire. Number 1. The Battle of Midway, 1976. The Battle of Midway stands as one of the rawest recreations of aerial warfare ever attempted. It was shot using real aircraft carriers, vintage planes, and actual combat footage from World War II spliced into the story. Directed by Jack Smythe, it dramatized the pivotal Pacific battle that changed the course of history. But what made it unforgettable was its unfiltered authenticity. The film used real veterans as consultants and demanded that every maneuver match historical records. Filming took place aboard operational naval ships, with aircraft taking off and landing for real. Several pilots called it the most dangerous film production they had ever seen. One sequence over the Pacific nearly ended in tragedy when a dive bomber lost altitude and barely cleared the ocean surface. Critics accused it of glorifying war, but pilots disagreed. They said it captured not glory, but survival. The constant noise, the confusion, the smell of fuel and fear mixing in the air. Smythe insisted on filming real explosions using full-scale mock-ups of carriers. The shock waves destroyed cameras and damaged sound equipment, but he refused to fake it. The controversy grew when veterans groups demanded cuts to footage showing men burned or dying. The studio stood firm, arguing that truth demanded discomfort. The result was a film so intense that theaters issued warnings for war survivors. Even decades later, fighter pilots say, "The Battle of Midway feels more like reliving a mission than watching entertainment." It remains a cinematic memorial to those who turned the tide of war not through heroics, but through endurance. 15 films, each one a heartbeat of the sky. Some glorified war, others mourned it, but all felt too real to ignore. Which of these made you feel the roar of engines in your chest? Share your thoughts below. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next descent into the stories that history tried to forget.